In the winter of 1069, William I divided his army into small units and sent them north with a single directive: destroy everything capable of sustaining human life. Barns were burned, livestock slaughtered, crops trampled into frozen mud. The operation was methodical, covering hundreds of miles, and by the time it concluded, over 100,000 people had starved to death in what would become known as the harrying of the North. This was not the chaos of war, but the deliberate engineering of famine as a tool of governance. The English monarchy did not evolve through ceremonial tradition alone. It was built on systems designed to centralize power, suppress resistance, and ensure the survival of the institution regardless of the human cost. From the Norman invasion to the Victorian era, the Crown adapted its methods to each crisis it faced: famine, plague, religious schism, civil war, transforming external threats into opportunities for expanding control. What emerged was not a series of individual rulers, but an architecture: administrative surveillance, judicial terror, physical isolation, and the calculated application of violence across generations. This is the story of how that architecture was constructed, how castles became prisons, how religious belief became indistinguishable from treason, how the state learned to manage fear not through spectacle alone, but through documentation, procedure, and the relentless refinement of power. The stones remain, the records endure, and the systems they represent shaped the landscape in ways that persist long after the crown itself retreated from public view. The Norman conquest replaced one system of governance with another. Under the Anglo-Saxons, kingship had been consultative. The Witan, a council of nobles and clergy, retained the right to elect monarchs from within the royal house. A king's authority depended on his willingness to accept counsel, to negotiate, to share power with those who claimed descent from the same tribal bloodlines. When that system failed, when Ethelred the Unready proved unable to manage Viking incursions, it collapsed not because of foreign invasion, but because the internal structure could not hold. William I introduced a different logic. He claimed England by conquest, not election, and he structured his new kingdom around a principle that was absolute: all land belonged to the king. What had been held by families passed down through generations was now granted to vassals in exchange for military service. The landed aristocracy became tenants. The concept of ancestral ownership disappeared. This was feudalism in its purest form, a hierarchy where every layer owed loyalty upward and received protection downward, with the crown at the apex. The harrying of the North demonstrated what happened when that loyalty was challenged. In 1069, northern England rebelled, supported by Danish forces and encouraged by Scottish raids. William's response was not to suppress the rebellion through battle, but to eliminate the capacity for future resistance. His army moved through Northumbria and Yorkshire in coordinated sweeps, burning every structure capable of storing grain, killing every animal that could be eaten, salting fields to prevent replanting. 16 years later, when royal surveyors arrived to compile the Domesday Book, vast stretches of the north were still recorded as Wasta Est, wasted. The land had not recovered. The population had not returned. The Domesday Book itself was something unprecedented. Completed in 1086, it was a comprehensive record of landholding, livestock, and taxable resources across England. Surveyors traveled from manor to manor, documenting every hide of land, every plough, every head of cattle. The book was not a census of people, but an inventory of assets, a tool for ensuring that the crown knew exactly what it controlled and what could be extracted. It represented the first instance of total administrative surveillance in English history, a system where the state's reach extended into the economic life of every subject. The purpose was not merely taxation, it was leverage. By knowing who owned what, the crown could enforce obligations, settle disputes in its favor, and ensure that no lord accumulated enough independent wealth to challenge royal authority. The Domesday Book made governance legible. It turned the abstract concept of the king's ownership into a written record that could be referenced, enforced, and expanded. What had been a military conquest became an administrative reality, inscribed in parchment and stored in the royal treasury. The transition from Anglo-Saxon consultation to Norman absolutism was not gradual. It was immediate, violent, and irreversible. The old system of tribal councils and elected kingship was replaced by a hierarchy enforced through castles, cavalry, and documentation. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by monks who had lived through the invasion, described William as a man who loved the tall stag as if he were its father, referring to the forest laws that restricted hunting to the nobility and punished poaching with mutilation. The king claimed not only the land, but the animals that lived on it, the trees that grew on it, the very air above it. This was the foundation. Everything that followed, the dungeons, the courts, the surveillance networks, was built on the logic established in those first decades after 1066. The crown was not a title passed through bloodlines, but a mechanism for extracting resources and suppressing challenges. It survived not because of divine favor, but because it created systems that outlasted individual monarchs. The Domesday Book was one of those systems. It remained in use for centuries, consulted in legal disputes, referenced in tax assessments, a permanent record of the moment when governance became documentation, and documentation became control. In the spring of 1315, it began to rain. Not the intermittent showers of a normal English spring, but torrential, unrelenting downpours that turned fields into bogs and made planting impossible. The rain continued through the summer. Grain that had been sown rotted in the ground. Crops that managed to sprout were washed away. By harvest time, the yield was catastrophic. For every 2 grains planted, only 1 was reaped, a return so low that farmers would have been better off not planting at all. The Great Famine had begun. It would last 3 years, kill between 5 and 12% of the population, and expose the fundamental weakness of the medieval state. When the harvest failed, the crown could do nothing to feed its people. Grain prices doubled within months. Salt, essential for preserving meat through the winter, rose by 33%. The poor, who had no reserves and lived season to season, were the first to starve. Reports from across England described scenes that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. In Bristol, the living struggled to bury the dead. In Northumbria, soldiers boiled the carcasses of diseased horses. In some regions, there were accounts of parents abandoning children, of infanticide, of cannibalism. A chronicler noted that prisoners in jails plucked and tore in pieces those newly incarcerated to eat them. The famine revealed something the Norman conquest had obscured: the limits of sovereignty. The crown claimed divine sanction, absolute authority over land and law, but it could not make grain grow. It could not stop the rain. The king and the church maintained private stores, enough to sustain themselves and their immediate retinues, but 95% of the population were peasants with no such reserves. They were left to fend for themselves, and when they failed, the crown offered no relief beyond public processions asking God for mercy. The political consequences were immediate. King Edward II, already unpopular for his reliance on favorites and his perceived incompetence in military affairs became the target of public resentment. In France, the famine was blamed on the sins of the people, a divine punishment for moral failure. In England, the blame fell on the king. His misrule, his immorality, his inability to govern. These were the explanations that circulated through a starving population. In August 1315, the king himself struggled to find bread for his entourage at St. Albans. The symbolic failure was complete. If the king could not feed himself, what authority did he possess? The famine subsided by 1317, but the demographic and economic damage persisted for decades. Europe's population did not return to pre-famine levels for 100 years. The weakened, malnourished survivors were left vulnerable to the next crisis, which arrived 30 years later in the form of plague. But the immediate lesson of the famine was this: the state's claim to absolute power was contingent on conditions it could not control. When those conditions failed, the legitimacy of the crown depended not on divine favor, but on its ability to maintain order and extract resources even as its subjects died. The famine also demonstrated the rigidity of the feudal economy. There was no mechanism for redistributing food from regions with surplus to regions in need. No central granary system, no relief infrastructure. The market existed, but it was local, fragmented, and constrained by poor roads and the absence of any coordinating authority. The crown could tax, it could enforce, but it could not provision. And in the gap between its claims to total authority and its actual capacity to govern, the seeds of future conflict were planted. The Black Death arrived in England in the summer of 1348, carried by ships from the continent. Within 2 years, it had killed approximately half the population. Entire villages were abandoned. Fields went unplowed. The labor force that had sustained the feudal economy, peasants bound to the land, obligated to work for their lords in exchange for protection, was decimated. The immediate consequence was a labor shortage more acute than anything England had ever experienced. Peasants who survived found themselves in a position of unprecedented leverage. There were fewer workers to plant, harvest, and maintain the estates of the nobility. Demand for labor spiked. Wages began to rise, sometimes by 20 to 60%, as lords competed for the remaining workforce. For the first time in generations, peasants could negotiate. They could refuse work. They could leave their manors in search of better terms elsewhere. The response from the Crown and Parliament was swift and unambiguous. In 1349, King Edward III issued the Ordinance of Labourers, followed 2 years later by the Statute of Labourers. These laws attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. They made it illegal for a worker to demand higher pay or for an employer to offer it. They prohibited peasants from leaving their home parish to seek better opportunities. Enforcement was backed by fines, imprisonment, and the threat of being branded as a criminal. The logic was clear. The plague had created a crisis, and the solution was to use the law to prevent the natural adjustment of the labor market. The lords who controlled Parliament were unwilling to accept a world where their wealth depended on negotiating with peasants. The feudal hierarchy required a fixed, subordinate labor class. If the plague had disrupted that structure, the state would restore it through coercion. But the laws were difficult to enforce. Peasants moved anyway, seeking work where it paid more. Employers, desperate for labor, ignored the statutes and offered higher wages in secret. The Crown lacked the administrative capacity to monitor every manor, every harvest, every wage negotiation. What the Statute of Labourers accomplished was not the restoration of pre-plague conditions, but the creation of widespread resentment. Peasants who had survived a biological catastrophe, who had lost family members and neighbors, who had been told their labor was essential, now found themselves criminalized for attempting to improve their circumstances. The resentment accumulated over 3 decades. By 1381, it exploded into open rebellion. The peasants' revolt began in Essex and Kent, sparked by a new poll tax that placed equal burden on the wealthy and the poor. But the underlying grievances were rooted in the labor laws enacted after the plague. The rebels marched on London, stormed the Tower, executed royal officials, and demanded the abolition of serfdom. They wanted freedom of movement, fair wages, and an end to the legal structures that bound them to the land. The revolt was suppressed. Its leaders were executed, but the long-term trajectory was clear. The Black Death had fundamentally altered the balance of power between lords and peasants. The Statute of Labourers could delay the collapse of feudalism, but it could not prevent it. Over the following century, serfdom gradually dissolved, replaced by wage labour and tenant farming. The plague had created conditions the state could not reverse through legislation alone. What the episode revealed was the Crown's priorities. When faced with a demographic collapse that killed half the population, the state did not provide relief or adjust to new realities. It attempted to preserve the existing hierarchy through legal coercion. The Statute of Labourers was not an emergency measure designed to help the population recover. It was a tool for ensuring that the surviving peasants remained subordinate, underpaid, and legally bound to their lords. The crisis became an opportunity to clarify and enforce control, even as that control grew harder to maintain. The castle dungeon was not originally designed as a punishment. In the early medieval period, imprisonment was rare. Those accused of crimes were held temporarily while awaiting trial, ransom, or execution. Detention itself was not the sentence. But as the monarchy centralized power and expanded its legal apparatus, the nature of imprisonment changed. The dungeon transitioned from a holding space to a site of psychological destruction, engineered through architecture to induce despair. The word dungeon derives from the French donjon, originally the keep or central tower of a castle where nobles resided. Over time, the term came to refer to the subterranean chambers beneath the keep, cold stone cells where light rarely reached, and prisoners were stored like inventory. These spaces were not designed for rehabilitation or reform. They were designed to isolate, to degrade, to make the prisoner invisible. The oubliette was the most extreme expression of this logic. The term comes from the French oublier, to forget. At Warwick Castle, the oubliette was a horizontal shaft, roughly 5 feet long and 3 feet high, paved with jagged stones. A prisoner placed inside could not sit upright, could not kneel, could not stand. The only position available was lying prone on the uneven surface where every movement caused pain. The ceiling was so low that even shifting weight required constant contact with stone. There was no light, no sound from the outside world, just the sensation of the body pressed against rock, hour after hour, until time itself became irrelevant. Other oubliettes were vertical shafts. The prisoner was lowered through a trapdoor in the floor and left in darkness. The only view of the world was a distant grate, far out of reach, through which scraps of food might occasionally be dropped. There was no means of escape, no possibility of communication. The prisoner existed in a state of absolute isolation, severed from human contact, from daylight, from any reference point that might orient them in time or space. These were not improvised cells. They were architectural features built into the design of the castle with deliberate intent. The placement of the stones, the dimensions of the shaft, the absence of windows or ventilation, all of it served a purpose. The oubliette was a machine for breaking the human mind, for ensuring that even if the prisoners survived, they would emerge fundamentally altered. Lancaster Castle contained a series of subterranean dungeons beneath the Well Tower, later known as the Witches' Tower. Prisoners held there during the 17th century included those accused of witchcraft, religious dissent, and other crimes against the state. The conditions were severe: damp stone walls, minimal food, no sanitation. Some prisoners died in these cells before ever facing trial. Others were held for months, years, in darkness, their existence known only to the jailers who fed them and the officials who had ordered their detention. The treatment of prisoners varied by social class, reinforcing the rigid hierarchies of the time. A nobleman accused of treason might be held in relatively comfortable quarters, allowed servants, books, even visitors. A common peasant accused of the same crime would be placed in a cell designed to maximize suffering. This differential treatment was not incidental. It was a deliberate feature of the system, a reminder that the law did not apply equally, and that one's status determined not only the nature of the punishment, but the conditions under which it was endured. The dungeon was also a space of opacity. Unlike public executions, which were designed to be seen, imprisonment occurred out of sight. The prisoner disappeared from the world, removed from family, community, and any possibility of outside intervention. This invisibility was part of the punishment. To be forgotten was to be erased, to exist in a state where no one could witness your suffering and no one would advocate for your release. The Crown did not need to justify what happened in the dungeons because no one outside the castle walls knew. The Tower of London was built by William I shortly after the Norman conquest, a stone fortress designed to dominate the city and keep its population in check. It was a royal palace, a treasury, a mint, and a menagerie. But its most enduring function was as a state prison, a facility where the Crown detained those it considered the most dangerous threats to its authority. The Tower's role evolved over centuries, but its purpose remained consistent: to isolate political rivals, suppress dissent, and demonstrate the consequences of challenging the sovereign. Unlike common jails, which held petty criminals and debtors, the Tower was reserved for high-profile prisoners: nobles, clergy, military commanders, anyone whose influence or ambition posed a risk to the Crown. The fortress became synonymous with the fate of those who fell from royal favor. Prisoners arrived through Traitor's Gate, a water entrance on the Thames. The symbolism was deliberate. Entering through this gate marked the prisoner as a traitor, a designation that carried the full weight of the state's disapproval. Once inside, the prisoner's experience depended almost entirely on their social status and the nature of their offense. Nobles and high-ranking officials might be housed in the Bloody Tower or other sections of the complex where conditions were relatively tolerable. Sir Walter Raleigh, imprisoned for 13 years on charges of conspiracy, was allowed to live with his family, keep servants, and conduct scientific experiments in his quarters. He wrote a history of the world during his confinement, a project that required access to books, paper, and sufficient light to work. This was imprisonment, but it was imprisonment designed to maintain the dignity of someone whose rank the Crown still, in some measure, acknowledged. Others faced harsher treatment: those accused of treason without the protection of noble rank, or those whose crimes were deemed particularly egregious, were placed in cells that more closely resembled the dungeons of other castles. The conditions varied, but the Tower's architecture ensured that even the most privileged prisoner understood they were at the mercy of the crown. The walls were thick, the doors were heavy, escape was impossible. The tower also functioned as a site of execution, though not in the public manner of Tower Hill. Only 7 people were executed within the tower's walls, a distinction reserved for those the crown wished to kill in relative privacy. Anne Boleyn, executed in 1536 for adultery and treason, was beheaded on Tower Green, away from the public gaze. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days' Queen, met the same fate in 1554. These executions were quieter, more controlled, designed to eliminate a threat without the spectacle that might turn the condemned into a martyr. Most prisoners, however, were marched to Tower Hill, just outside the fortress, where public executions were carried out. The procession from the tower to the scaffold was part of the ritual, a final display of the prisoner's fall from power. The crowd that gathered was not there merely to witness death, but to participate in a collective affirmation of the state's authority. The execution was a performance, and the audience was essential to its meaning. Inside the tower, prisoners left traces of their confinement. The Beauchamp Tower contains graffiti carved into the stone walls by those held there over the centuries. Names, dates, prayers, symbols, evidence of the psychological strain, the acute boredom, the need to mark one's existence in some permanent way. These carvings were acts of resistance, small assertions of identity in a space designed to erase it. The tower's effectiveness as a prison lay in its dual nature. It was both a physical structure and a symbol. To be imprisoned in the tower was to be removed from the world, cut off from allies, isolated from any possibility of rescue. But it was also to be marked as a threat to the crown, a designation that carried consequences beyond the walls of the fortress. Even after release, if release came, the stain of imprisonment remained. The tower endured as a state prison for centuries, adapting to the changing nature of political conflict, but retaining its essential function, the secure detention of those the crown could not afford to leave free. It was a tool of governance, one of many in the architecture of control that defined the English monarchy. And like the dungeons, the oubliettes, and the surveillance networks, it served a purpose that transcended any individual monarch or political crisis. It was permanent, institutional, and designed to outlast the people it held. In 1534, Henry VIII declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. The decision was not primarily theological. It was administrative, a consolidation of power that merged religious authority with the apparatus of the state. By severing ties with Rome and claiming spiritual jurisdiction over his subjects, Henry transformed the nature of dissent. What had been a matter of conscience, what one believed about scripture, salvation, or the legitimacy of the papacy, became a question of obedience to the crown. Religious belief and political loyalty were now inseparable. The legal framework for this merger was the Act of Supremacy, which required all subjects to acknowledge the king as the head of the church. Refusal was treason. Those who maintained allegiance to the Pope, who refused to accept the king's spiritual authority, faced prosecution not for heresy, but for betraying the state. The distinction mattered. Heresy was a crime against God, adjudicated by ecclesiastical courts with theological arguments and the possibility of recantation. Treason was a crime against the sovereign, prosecuted in royal courts with no room for doctrinal debate. The penalty was death, often by methods designed to maximize both suffering and public spectacle. Henry's reign saw the execution of Catholics who refused to accept the new order and Protestants who pushed for reforms beyond what the king deemed acceptable. The inconsistency was deliberate. The crown was not enforcing a specific theology, but asserting control over the definition of orthodoxy itself. Sir Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor, was beheaded in 1535 for refusing to take the oath of supremacy. His execution was not the result of theological error, but political defiance. He had been a loyal servant of the crown in every other respect, but his inability to accept the king's spiritual authority made him a threat that could not be tolerated. The reign of Mary I, beginning in 1553, reversed the religious settlement but intensified the violence. Mary was a devout Catholic who sought to restore England to the papal fold. Her method was systematic persecution. Over the course of 5 years, approximately 300 Protestants were burned at the stake. The burnings were public, conducted in town squares and marketplaces, designed to serve as both punishment and warning. The condemned were tied to stakes, surrounded by bundles of wood, and set alight. Death could take minutes or longer, depending on the wind, the quality of the fuel, and whether the executioners showed mercy by hanging the prisoner first or placing gunpowder around the neck to hasten the end. The justification for burning was theological. Fire was seen as the appropriate punishment for heresy because it destroyed the body completely, preventing any physical remnant that might become a relic or focus of veneration. Heresy was described as a social disease, a contamination that threatened the spiritual health of the community. The heretic's body had to be eradicated entirely to protect innocent souls from corruption. This logic framed the burnings not as cruelty, but as a necessary surgery, the removal of a malignant presence. Mary's persecutions earned her the nickname Bloody Mary, a label that persisted long after her death. But the scale of violence under her reign was not unprecedented. What distinguished her approach was the transparency. The burnings were public, frequent, and unapologetic. The crown made no attempt to disguise the coercion. Protestantism was illegal, and those who practiced it would die in flames. Elizabeth I, who succeeded Mary in 1558, faced the opposite challenge. England was now predominantly Protestant, but a significant Catholic minority remained, many of whom viewed Elizabeth as illegitimate. Her response was to reframe the conflict. Rather than prosecuting Catholics for their beliefs, she prosecuted them for treason. Catholic priests entering England were automatically guilty of a capital crime, not because they preached heresy, but because their presence was deemed a threat to national security. The distinction allowed the crown to avoid accusations of religious persecution while maintaining the ability to execute dissenters. The method of execution for Catholic priests was hanging, drawing, and quartering, a procedure designed to inflict maximum pain and degradation. The condemned was hanged until nearly unconscious, then cut down while still alive. The executioner opened the abdomen and removed the intestines, which were burned in front of the prisoner. Finally, the body was beheaded and divided into quarters, with the parts displayed in public locations as a warning. The brutality was not incidental. It was the point. The execution was meant to be remembered, discussed, feared. Elizabeth's government also developed an extensive surveillance apparatus to enforce these laws. Pursuivants, or priest hunters, operated across the country, searching homes for hidden clergy. These hunters were professionals, trained in architectural forensics. They measured the external dimensions of a house and compared them to the internal layout, looking for discrepancies that might indicate a concealed room. They tapped walls, ripped up floorboards, examined chimneys and staircases for irregularities. The builder, Nicholas Owen, constructed elaborate priest holes, hidden chambers built into the structure of Catholic estates that saved hundreds of lives, but many priests were still discovered, often after days of hiding in cramped, airless spaces. The pursuivants operated on tips from informants, a network of neighbors, servants, and travelers who reported suspicious activity in exchange for financial rewards. Informants received 1/3 of the property forfeited by convicted recusants, Catholics who refused to attend Anglican services. The incentive structure turned communities into surveillance networks, where trust eroded and every conversation carried the risk of denunciation. Families developed strategies to survive. Many became church papists, attending Protestant services to avoid fines while practicing Catholicism in secret. They lived in a state of constant insecurity, never certain whether a servant might betray them, whether a visitor might be a government spy, whether the next knock on the door would be pursuivants with a warrant. The psychological toll was immense. Fear became a permanent condition, not the result of occasional enforcement, but the baseline of daily life. The Reformation state achieved something the medieval monarchy had not: the complete integration of belief and obedience. By making religious practice a matter of law, the crown extended its authority into the interior lives of its subjects. What one believed, how one worshipped, even what one thought in private, all of it became subject to state supervision. The dungeons and the gallows remained, but the machinery of control had expanded beyond physical detention. The state now claimed jurisdiction over the soul. The priest hole was an architectural solution to a legal problem. When Catholic priests became criminals simply by entering England, those who sheltered them needed a way to hide them during searches. The solution was to build concealed chambers within the structure of the house itself, spaces so carefully integrated into walls, staircases, and chimneys that they would remain undetected even under close inspection. Nicholas Owen, a Jesuit lay brother, became the foremost designer of these hiding places. His work spanned decades, and his creations were masterpieces of deception. Some priest holes were accessed through false panels in walls, triggered by hidden latches. Others were built into the thickness of chimneys, disguised by the soot and heat that made them seem impassable. Still others were concealed beneath staircases or behind wardrobes, with entrances so narrow that they could only be accessed by removing furniture or lifting floorboards. The chambers themselves were barely large enough for a man to crouch. Ventilation was minimal, often just a few small holes drilled through to the outside, masked by the natural imperfections of old stone or wood. A priest hiding in one of these spaces might remain there for hours or days, depending on how long the search lasted. Some died from lack of oxygen, others from dehydration or the sheer physical strain of remaining motionless in a confined space. But many survived, and the priest holes became an essential tool for the survival of Catholic clergy in England. The pursuivants, however, adapted. They developed techniques specifically designed to find these hidden chambers. The most effective method was measurement. A hunter would pace the exterior of a house, counting steps and estimating dimensions, then compare those measurements to the interior layout. If the internal rooms did not account for the full footprint of the building, there was a hidden space somewhere. The discrepancy might be as small as a few feet, but it was enough to prompt a more invasive search. Once a suspected area was identified, the pursuivants used hammers to tap walls, listening for the hollow sound that indicated empty space behind the plaster or paneling. They examined chimneys, checking for false backs or concealed ledges. They inspected staircases, looking for steps that seemed too thick or risers that did not align with the floor above. They measured floorboards, searching for sections that had been cut and replaced. Every architectural feature became a potential hiding place, and every house was treated as a puzzle to be solved. The searches were invasive and destructive. Pursuivants had legal authority to enter any property, break through walls, and dismantle furniture if they suspected a priest was hiding. Homeowners had no recourse. Resistance was itself a crime, punishable by fines or imprisonment. The searches could last hours, with the hunters methodically working through each room, tapping, measuring, dismantling. The goal was not merely to find the priest, but to demonstrate the futility of resistance. Even if the priest escaped detection, the household was left with shattered walls, broken furniture, and the knowledge that they would be searched again. The psychological dimension of the priest hole was as important as its physical design. For the priest hiding inside, the experience was one of absolute vulnerability. He could hear the pursuivants moving through the house, their footsteps, their voices, the sound of hammers striking walls. He had no way of knowing how close they were or whether they had found the entrance. His survival depended entirely on the quality of the construction and the thoroughness of the search. If he was discovered, he would be dragged out, arrested, and eventually executed. If he survived, he would have to emerge from the chamber, cramped, dehydrated, possibly injured, and continue the work that had brought him to England in the first place. For the household sheltering the priest, the arrival of pursuivants created a different kind of terror. They knew the priest was hidden somewhere in the house. They knew the penalties for harboring him, and they knew that the pursuivants were experts, trained to find what was meant to be unfindable. The tension of the search was almost unbearable, each moment stretching as the hunters moved closer to the hiding place. If the priest was found, the entire household faced prosecution. Their property would be forfeited, their reputations destroyed, their lives potentially forfeit. The network of informants made the system even more insidious. Pursuivants did not conduct random searches. They acted on tips, often from people who lived in or near the targeted household. A servant who resented their treatment, a neighbor who suspected Catholic sympathies, a business rival looking to settle a score. The financial incentive, 1/3 of the forfeited property, ensured a steady stream of denunciations, some accurate, many not. The result was a climate of pervasive suspicion, where every conversation, every visitor, every deviation from expected behavior could be interpreted as evidence of harboring a priest. The priest hunters were not soldiers. They were bureaucrats operating within a legal framework that gave them extraordinary power. They kept records, filed reports, and followed procedures. Their work was methodical, patient, and highly effective. Over the course of Elizabeth's reign, hundreds of Catholic priests were captured, tried, and executed. The priest hole saved many, but it could not save all, and the knowledge that such spaces existed only intensified the efforts to find them. Nicholas Owen himself was eventually captured in 1606, betrayed after a search at Hindlip Hall that lasted 4 days. He was taken to the Tower of London and subjected to torture, pressed for information about the locations of other priest holes and the identities of those who sheltered priests. He revealed nothing. He died under torture, his body broken, but his secrets intact. His work, however, survived. Many of the priest holes he built remain today, hidden within the walls of English manor houses, silent evidence of a time when architecture became a battlefield and survival depended on the ability to disappear. The Court of Star Chamber was established in the late 15th century to address a specific problem: powerful nobles who could intimidate juries and escape prosecution in common law courts. By creating a separate tribunal composed of privy councillors and judges, the Crown ensured that influential defendants could be held accountable. The court had no jury. It operated in private, and its procedures were flexible, unconstrained by the common law traditions that governed other courts. By the Tudor and Stuart eras, the Star Chamber had evolved into something very different. It became a political weapon, used to suppress dissent, punish speech, and enforce the Crown's authority over subjects who had committed no crime under existing law. The court's jurisdiction was vast and vague. It could prosecute any action deemed morally reprehensible or contrary to the interests of the state, even if that action was technically legal. This gave the Crown nearly unlimited power to define what constituted an offence and who could be prosecuted for it. The defining feature of the Star Chamber was the ex officio oath. Defendants were required to swear at the beginning of proceedings that they would answer all questions truthfully. This created what legal scholars later called a cruel trilemma. The defendant had three options, all of them damaging. They could answer truthfully and incriminate themselves. They could lie and face prosecution for perjury. Or they could refuse to answer and be held in contempt of court. There was no way to avoid self-incrimination without committing another offence. The oath was administered before the defendant knew what questions would be asked or what evidence the court possessed. They were required to swear in advance, to tell the truth about matters they had not yet been informed of. This procedural trap eliminated the possibility of a defense based on silence or ignorance. The defendant's only protection, the ability to refuse to answer incriminating questions, was removed before the trial even began. The Star Chamber could not impose the death penalty, but its punishments were designed to be permanent and degrading. Defendants could be fined enormous sums, amounts so large that they bankrupted entire families. They could be imprisoned indefinitely, held without trial in the Tower or other royal prisons, and they could be subjected to physical mutilation, branding, ear cropping, nose slitting, and public humiliation in the pillory. William Prynne, a lawyer and Puritan pamphleteer, was prosecuted by the Star Chamber in 1634 for writing a book that criticized the theatre. The court found the work seditious, an attack on the morals of the realm and, by extension, on the Crown itself. Prynne was sentenced to life imprisonment, fined £5,000, and ordered to have both ears cut off. He was also branded on both cheeks with the letters S and L, standing for seditious libella. The branding was done with a hot iron, the letters seared into his face as a permanent mark of his offence. Prynne was brought back to the Star Chamber 3 years later for continuing to write critical pamphlets from prison. This time, the remnants of his ears, what little had been left after the first mutilation, were cut off completely. The punishment was ritualistic, a public demonstration of the state's willingness to mark the bodies of those who defied it. The scars were permanent, visible to anyone who looked at Prynne for the rest of his life. A constant reminder of the consequences of dissent. The court's proceedings were opaque. There was no public record of trials, no transcripts available for review, no mechanism for appeal. Decisions were made in private, and the reasoning behind them was rarely explained. This opacity served a purpose. It meant that defendants had no way to predict what would be considered an offence or what punishment might follow. The uncertainty itself was a tool of control, discouraging speech and behavior that might, under some interpretation, be deemed unacceptable. The Star Chamber also prosecuted offences that were not crimes under common law, but were considered threats to social order. Libel, slander, conspiracy, even behavior that might encourage others to break the law. All of these fell within the court's jurisdiction. The definition of conspiracy was particularly broad. It did not require an actual plan to commit a crime, only actions or words that might lead others to consider unlawful behavior. This allowed the court to prosecute speech, association, and even thought, as long as it could be framed as a threat to the state. The court functioned for over 150 years, from the late 15th century until its abolition in 1641. During that time, it developed legal concepts that would persist long after the court itself was gone. The idea of seditious libel, speech that criticizes the government and might incite resistance, originated in the Star Chamber. So did the modern understanding of conspiracy, the concept that planning or encouraging illegal activity is itself a crime. These legal frameworks were refined in a court that operated without juries, without public scrutiny, and without the procedural protections that existed in other legal settings. The abolition of the Star Chamber came during the English Civil War, part of a broader effort by Parliament to dismantle the instruments of royal absolutism. But the legacy of the court remained. Its procedures influenced the development of legal systems in England and its colonies. The ex officio oath, though eventually abandoned, shaped debates about self-incrimination and the rights of defendants. The concept of libel, first weaponized by the Star Chamber, became a permanent feature of English law. The court's most lasting impact, however, was psychological. For the subjects who lived under its jurisdiction, the Star Chamber represented the Crown's ability to prosecute anything, at any time, for any reason. It was a reminder that the law was not a fixed set of rules, but a tool that could be adapted, expanded, and wielded against anyone the state deemed a threat. The uncertainty, the opacity, the permanent physical marks left on those it punished, all of it reinforced a single message. Obedience was not optional, and resistance would be met with violence that left scars the world could see. The execution of Charles I on January 30th, 1649, was an event without precedent in English history. A king, anointed by God and claiming divine authority, was tried by a court convened by his own subjects, found guilty of treason, and beheaded in public. The act shattered the theoretical foundation of monarchy. If the king could be executed, then royal authority was not divinely ordained, but contingent, subject to judgment, and ultimately revocable. The trial took place in Westminster Hall. Charles refused to recognize the legitimacy of the court, arguing that no earthly authority had jurisdiction over a sovereign. He would not enter a plea. He would not participate in the proceedings. His position was absolute. The king answered only to God, and any attempt to prosecute him was not merely illegal, but sacrilegious. The court proceeded anyway. Witnesses testified. Evidence was presented. And on January 27th, Charles was sentenced to death as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy. The execution was staged outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. A scaffold was constructed, draped in black, with the executioner and his assistant masked to prevent identification. Charles was allowed to speak briefly before his death, addressing the small crowd that had been permitted to witness the event. He maintained his innocence, insisted on his divine right, and claimed that his death was a martyrdom. Then he placed his head on the block, and the executioner brought down the axe. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Many groaned, some wept, a few dipped handkerchiefs in the blood, believing it might have miraculous properties. The execution was a rupture, a moment when the established order was visibly, irrevocably broken. For those who supported the king, it was a crime against God. For those who had demanded his death, it was a necessary act of justice. But for everyone, it was a demonstration that power, even the power of kings, was not absolute. The Commonwealth government that followed attempted to legitimize the regicide by framing it as the act of a sovereign parliament, exercising authority on behalf of the people. But the legitimacy was fragile. England had never been a republic. The machinery of governance was still built around the concept of monarchy, and without a king, the system struggled to function. Cromwell's protectorate filled the vacuum, but it was always provisional, a temporary arrangement that lacked the deep roots of dynastic rule. When Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, the first priority was retribution. The surviving regicides, those who had signed the death warrant of Charles I, were hunted down. Some had fled to the continent or the American colonies. Others had remained in England, hoping for leniency. None received it. The trials were swift, the verdicts predetermined. Those captured were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most severe punishment available under English law. The executions took place in October 1660. Thomas Harrison, one of the most prominent regicides, was the first to die. He was hanged at Charing Cross, cut down while still alive, and placed on a table where the executioner opened his abdomen and pulled out his intestines. The procedure was conducted in full view of the crowd, a deliberate spectacle designed to maximize horror and reinforce the consequences of challenging royal authority. Harrison reportedly remained conscious throughout, watching as his own organs were removed and burned. Other regicides followed. Thomas Scott, Adrian Scrope, and several others were executed in the same manner over the following days. The executions were public, conducted at locations across London to ensure maximum visibility. The crowds were large, drawn by the promise of spectacle and the opportunity to witness the final moments of men who had participated in the most extraordinary political act of the century. But death was not sufficient punishment for all the regicides. Those who had already died were not exempt from the crown's revenge. In January 1661, the bodies of Oliver Cromwell, Henry Ireton, and John Bradshaw were exhumed from Westminster Abbey. They were hanged in their coffins at Tyburn, the traditional site of public executions, then beheaded. The heads were placed on spikes atop Westminster Hall, where they remained for decades, decaying slowly in the open air. The posthumous executions served no legal purpose. The men were already dead, but the ritual was symbolically essential. The crown needed to demonstrate that the regicide had been an unforgivable crime, an act so monstrous that even death could not erase the guilt. By desecrating the bodies of the dead, the Restoration government reinforced the message that the monarchy was sacred, inviolable, and beyond challenge. The retribution extended beyond the regicides themselves. Cromwell's supporters, even those who had not signed the death warrant, were stripped of property, titles, and legal protections. Families were ruined. Estates were confiscated. The message was clear. Participation in the Commonwealth government, even in minor capacities, would be punished. The restoration of the monarchy required not just the return of the king, but the total erasure of the republican experiment. The executions and exhumations were designed to restore fear. The Commonwealth had demonstrated that royal authority could be overthrown. The Restoration needed to prove that such an act would never be tolerated again. The bodies of the regicides mutilated and displayed, became warnings, physical evidence of what happened to those who challenged the crown. The heads on Westminster Hall remained visible for years, a permanent reminder that the monarchy had returned and that its power, once challenged, would be reasserted with maximum violence. By the 18th century, the monarchy faced a different kind of crisis. The public spectacle of violence that had defined earlier eras, the burnings, the hangings, the mutilations, was becoming politically untenable. Public opinion mattered in ways it had not before. The press was expanding, literacy was rising, and the population was increasingly willing to question the actions of the crown. The solution was not to abandon control, but to relocate it, to move the machinery of power out of public view and into private spaces where scrutiny was limited. George III's reign illustrated this transition. The king suffered from episodes of severe mental illness, periods of mania where he became incoherent, agitated, and unable to govern. The symptoms were visible to those around him. He would talk for hours until he was hoarse and foaming at the mouth. His language became coarse, his behavior erratic. During one episode, he reportedly addressed a tree as the King of Prussia. The condition was unpredictable, and the court had no effective treatment. The response was to isolate him. At Kew Palace, the king was subjected to treatments that were as much about control as they were about medicine. Blistering involved applying caustic powders to his legs, creating painful wheals that were believed to draw out the illness. Cupping used heated glass suctions placed on the skin, leaving marks described by his daughter as red and in great wheals, as if it had been scourged by cords. The king was restrained by attendants when his behavior became unmanageable, held down while the treatments were administered. The final 10 years of George III's life were spent in near-total isolation at Windsor Castle. He was blind, possibly deaf, and increasingly detached from the world around him. His condition was kept private, hidden from the public, and managed within the confines of the royal household. The Prince Regent governed in his place, but the king remained alive, a silent figure whose presence was acknowledged but whose reality was concealed. The retreat to secluded residences was not unique to George III. Throughout the 19th century, the monarchy increasingly relied on private estates to manage both personal crises and public image. Osborne House, purchased by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in 1845, became a family refuge on the Isle of Wight, far from the scrutiny of London. Frogmore House served a similar function, a quiet estate where members of the royal family could retreat from court life. These properties were private in ways that royal palaces were not. Access was controlled, visitors were limited, and what happened within their walls remained largely unknown to the outside world. The privacy allowed the monarchy to cultivate an image of domestic respectability while managing the realities that contradicted it. Victoria's extended mourning after Albert's death, her withdrawal from public duties, the tensions within the royal family. All of this could be managed more easily in private settings where the press could not observe and the public could not question. But the retreat also reflected a deeper shift. The monarchy was no longer the center of governance. Parliament had assumed most of the functions that had once been royal prerogatives. The crown retained symbolic authority, but the actual mechanisms of power, legislation, taxation, military command, were exercised by elected officials and appointed ministers. The monarchy's role was increasingly ceremonial, and its survival depended on maintaining public support rather than enforcing obedience through violence. The Victorian era exposed the contradictions of this arrangement. While the monarchy projected an image of family devotion and moral propriety from Osborne House, the majority of the population lived in conditions of desperate poverty. Industrial workers labored in factories with fewer protections than medieval peasants had enjoyed. The slums of London, Manchester, and other cities were overcrowded, disease-ridden, and violent. The wealth generated by industrialization flowed upward, enriching a small elite while leaving the working class in misery. The Jack the Ripper murders of 1888 became a focal point for this tension. The killings took place in Whitechapel, one of the poorest districts in London, and the victims were women whose poverty had forced them into prostitution. The brutality of the murders, the systematic mutilation of the bodies, the apparent skill with which they were carried out, shocked the city. But the murders also forced a confrontation with the misery that had been ignored. The press coverage was extensive, and for the first time, middle and upper-class readers were exposed to detailed descriptions of life in the slums. The murders were described as the ghoulish embodiment of all the cruelty, vice, and inhumanity festering beneath the gentle veneer of Victorian society. They represented a literal ripping of the carefully cultivated facade, exposing conditions that had existed for decades but had been invisible to those who did not live in them. The response was not immediate reform, but the murders planted seeds. Over the following decades, social progress began, slowly, driven by the recognition that the existing system could not continue without addressing the misery it had created. The monarchy's retreat into opacity during this period was not an abandonment of power, but an adaptation. The crown could no longer rule through fear, through dungeons and executions and public displays of violence. Instead, it ruled through absence, through the cultivation of an image that concealed the realities of both royal life and national conditions. The secluded estates, the private treatments, the careful management of public appearances, all of it served the same purpose as the oubliettes and the Star Chamber had in earlier centuries. It preserved the institution, ensuring its survival by controlling what could be seen and what remained hidden. The architecture of control had not disappeared. It had evolved. The tower still stood, a monument to centuries of detention and execution. The records of the Star Chamber remained in archives, evidence of a legal system designed to eliminate resistance. The priest holes hidden within the walls of manor houses testified to a time when belief itself was criminalized. But the methods had changed. The crown no longer needed to demonstrate its power through spectacle. It maintained control through privacy, through the careful separation of image from reality, through the retreat into spaces where its vulnerabilities could not be observed. The institutional logic remained consistent across centuries. The monarchy survived not because it was divinely ordained or morally superior, but because it adapted its mechanisms of control to each era's challenges. From the engineered famine of the harrying of the North to the administrative surveillance of the Domesday Book, from the dungeons of medieval castles to the procedural traps of the Star Chamber, from the public executions of regicides to the private isolation of a mad king, the crown demonstrated a capacity for institutional survival that transcended individual monarchs, political crises, and changing social conditions. The stones of the tower, the low ceilings of the oubliettes, the records of trials and executions, the hidden chambers built into walls, all of it remained as evidence. The architecture endured even as the methods shifted, and the legacy of that architecture, the systems of violence, surveillance, and control that had been refined over a millennium, continued to shape the landscape long after the crown itself had retreated from view.